Greetings, class. For this segment, we're going to answer and address the question, why is it important to understand trauma in making cultures of peace? And we haven't talked a whole lot about trauma or not really dealt with it in depth. So let me go ahead and provide a definition or understanding of trauma. What is trauma? Trauma is the experience of severe psychological distress following any terrible experience. These might be life-threatening encounters. They might have heavily charged emotional interactions. Um, sufferers may develop emotional disturbances such as extreme anxiety, anger, sadness, PTSD, or survivor's guilt. Um, that's PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. Survivor's guilt. That's a kind of specific guilt that sometimes those who survive traumatic events will actually feel guilty over the fact that they're alive, or that they didn't do more to help others, and they ended up surviving. And anyway, so it's a kind of extreme guilt. Um, they may experience ongoing problems with sleep. Trauma can cause physical pain. There can be different kinds of turbulence in personal and professional lives, and a diminished sense of self-worth, sometimes caused by the overwhelming amounts of stress. In short, um, all of the types of emotions that we can experience at more elevated and aggravated levels, and that at some point these can actually be damaging, sometimes by being paralyzing or crippling, and in other ways by causing us to feel distant or alienated from society. But again, so we're dealing with this as psychological distress. Um, and so in conflicts where there are really elevated levels of stress and distress, that can create some really big divisions between individuals, between groups, separating individuals from groups. Um, but this trauma really can become a challenge as we're trying to revisit, relearn, and establish peace. Um, if we think about the divisions in the US right now, say between conservatives and liberals, we might start getting some of the understanding when we really focus on who are the individuals who have been hurt the most, right? It's not the average person who has arguments that's going to feel traumatized, but it's the people who have been hurt the most. And when you look at the people who have been hurt the most, right? If you look at the hate crimes that are happening in this country, for example, right? After you've been attacked, physically assaulted for what you felt to be no reason, establishing trust with others or trust with others from that group again is going to be exceptionally difficult, right? Why would you trust someone after they've done something completely horrible to you or completely horrible to people that you know for what you see as no reason, right? Um, so if you just think of that at kind of its just basic level, trauma emerges in response as a direct result of negative experiences, and it tends to be kind of situated or featured into our lives in ways that acts as either a distancing or defense mechanism. Um, which that I don't want to say that there's anything unhealthy about that. When people have been mean to me in ways that I was traumatized by it, I have definitely tried to avoid spending any more time interacting with those individuals, right? Because why would you go there? There just wouldn't be any reason you would go around like to invite more of the harm that has been previously inflicted. But in building a culture of peace, we have to build bridges, not walls. We have to build tables, not fences. We need to bring people together. We need to share. We need to have dialogue. And so, in order for that to happen, it's of absolute necessity that the trauma is acknowledged and addressed. And that isn't something that's necessarily easy to do. Some people, for example, would say that we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the issues of slave reparations and the ongoing history of racial oppression and injustice. Right, and we see different examples. We've talked some about Black Lives Matter and some of the other details. But a person who's very sincere and sensitive to the struggles acknowledges that in these histories of oppression, that there are a lot of people who have lived and are still living under extreme levels of structural violence and sometimes direct physical violence as well. And so you can't bring the people together until the people who have been victimized can feel some sort of sense of justice and understanding coming out of what those experiences would be like. On the other side, I don't want to say it's the oppressor. I want to say it's the perpetrator. The steps would need to be taken then to establish that a perpetrator is ready for some sort of atonement, reflection, understanding, acknowledgement, and so forth. And there might be things that can be done, right? Depending on what the history that's being resolved is being reflective of. Some criminologists that I know who study hate crimes and hate groups in America are very quick to point out that it's usually histories of oppression of their own, right? Frequently it's economic. But these pejorative experiences in the formative years of those members contributes to their identification in organizations which discriminate and scapegoat against other groups, right? It's a common strategy. In some ways, you could say it's timeless. Figuring out who to blame for your problems is something that's a really quite popular social behavior. The problem is just that in its extreme forms, it leads to really nefarious and damaging and malicious consequences. But in any case, one of the steps or one of the strategies for dealing with, trauma is actually coming to an understanding of how all have suffered. Now, that's not to say that one person's suffering can be justified in the suffering of another, but it is an understanding that through the dialogue and understanding that everybody has had painful experiences, if we make an agreement to be collaborative and acknowledging all of the pain of all of those who have suffered, we bring more people to the table. Sometimes, however, that can be something that's, needs to be very strategic. If the person who's been victimized by an individual has to listen to how they've suffered before they get an apology or an acknowledgement about what they've gone through, it's not likely to do much to help them. They might not see a whole lot of need for having that other person at the table. Again, that's the wedge that trauma puts there. But if we take the wedge out of the context and stop having people be divided by these past experiences and the memory and the pain. So I mentioned, some of the way it's played out in the context of North America and the United States. But where we've seen studies on this done in Africa, right? Post-apartheid South Africa has had to take a lot of work to really address the pain and suffering. And not all of the people are ameliorated with this kind of, the person shared a story and now I have closure, right? For some people, it might be that, but for other people, they need to see the enforcement of, penalties. They need to see justice served. And for other people, it's going to take a lot of time. And for other people, they're going to have to see the damages and, again, the restitution and the payments and the healing, before they completely get over it. And for some people, they will never completely get over it. Um, and in another context or two, we see tribal communities where their collectivism really holds them together. So if a person is, pushed out, that's a really painful experience for them. The tribe could bring someone back in, and that happens within the authority of a chief, but also under the context of, um, providing some sort of, this is what our community does, and usually that tribal leader will also, put the specific victim through a process of making sure that they heal, right? So it's individual and group healing that has to take place in order for that to work out. In Rwanda, uh, they went through processes of at a local level of gacaca, which was intended to heal again the community. And in Rwanda in 1994, there was a brutal genocide that took place. This was part of the fallout of the colonial rule, the Hutus and the Tutsis. There had been violence from one group on the other, and vice versa. And you end up with a part of this story where this kind of determination that the Belgians made, that the people who were the same were actually different, had grown onto them, and then they started to live by the rules of kind of us and them. But so you end up with a situation where lots of people have done horrible things, to their neighbors. And there's no real way to see, on the one hand, that half the country would be put in jail while the other half of the country is still suffering. As much as the US tries to build a lot of prisons, we couldn't put half of our country into prison. Well, Rwanda can't even put, as many people in a prison as we do, right? Because jailing people is expensive. It's also highly profitable here, but, not to go down that tangent. But so in Rwanda, they basically had this process. I don't want to say it was amnesty, but they had a process where some people went to jail, but the significant numbers didn't. And those who did go to jail, they had sentences that did not include life sentences for the most part. So everybody eventually would get released. And after they're released, they're going back to the same communities where their victims lived, right? Because that's what tribal communities do. It's not like the kind of diaspora that you have in North America, where a person graduates high school and then moves to go to college and then graduates and moves to get their first job and then move because they got a promotion and stuff. But that people live in a community, and you, in some contexts, would really expect to spend, the overwhelming amount of your life within, 5 miles of where you were born or something. But so if you imagine a person has had family members murdered by somebody, and now that murderer is going to live next door again, there is no way to do that without recognizing, acknowledging, and responding to the trauma, right? And I can't necessarily say that I could walk you through how you would get over it, because I've had loved ones who've died, and you never get over it, or at least I haven't. And I've been working on this stuff for 7 and 9 years, right? And I don't want to get over it because memories are all I have. So I don't want to say that I could walk you through getting over it, but I do want to tell you that you don't get to have a murderer get living next to the person that they victimized, until you have handled that trauma. And that when you do handle that trauma, you can, at least in some cases, which has been proven by the people who've done this, have relationships where it's mutually beneficial. Um, and it happens through a process in which the terrible and distressing experiences first they're coped with, and then they're resolved, and then they're built upon, and it can be done. The other alternative, however, is that when it's not done, when and happens whether or not you're thinking about building a culture of peace, but when people don't deal with the trauma, the conditions almost always deteriorate. Um, right? And I've seen this in far too many painful examples in my life. Um, Most significantly, I'm thinking of large numbers of the people I know suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder also have substance abuse issues, which some people actually do say that they're self-medicating. Um, but again, that's unresolved trauma, and that kind of unresolved trauma will continue to inflict damage um, to individuals and harm abilities to make connection in relationships. So um, I hope this helps to think about answering the question, why it's important. Um, Clearly, I believe that trauma is essential, um, or it's essential that we deal with trauma and dealing with the development of cultures of peace. See you on the next one.